Good morning and welcome. We're so thrilled to have so many of you here. We're grateful that you are a part of this experience at the Center for Economic Inclusion at our Reckoning for Truth, Trust, and Racial Justice Forum. We are thrilled to have a wonderful conversation with each one of you today and glad that you're making time to take advantage of this opportunity here at the Center for Economic Inclusion. I'm Tawana Black. I'm the founder and CEO at the Center for Economic Inclusion and thrilled to be able to welcome you here for today's forum, which is on the Standing in the Gap, the case for family sustaining wages in Minnesota. As we launch today's program, I want to encourage you to take note of our social media handles and hashtags for digital media engagement and continue this conversation on screen and out in the ecosystem by sharing your thoughts, your observations, things that you hear from our speakers on today that you believe other people need to hear as well, and join in with us. So please take note of the hashtags that you see available on the screen and others, and tag our speakers and engagement leaders from the center on that as well. We want to take some time now to thank our sponsor of this research, the McKnight Foundation. The McKnight Foundation has been a wonderful partner and investor in the Center for Economic Inclusion since we first began in 2017, and we are grateful for their confidence in both our work and our impact. Hats off to the McKnight Foundation for their continued support of the Center for Economic Inclusion. At the Center for Economic Inclusion, headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota, we've been leading the charge nationally to build racially just, inclusive, and equitable regional economies for 7 years. Our team supports business and government leaders in their journeys to become anti-racist, build anti-racist organizations, and measure the impact of those efforts both on their own bottom line and our regional economy and the economic mobility of people of color as well. Today's research and the solutions that we offer are anchored in our vision for inclusive regional economic growth. We believe, as you see here on the screen, that an inclusive economy is one where all people have all that they need, the knowledge, the connections and relationships, and the resources to thrive. And that prosperity and poverty cannot be predicted by race, by gender, by zip code, or job title. Building that inclusive economy in regions both here in Minnesota and across the country requires action, moving beyond intent and hopes and dreams to a place of actually taking daily action inside our organization and within the spheres of our influence to ensure that our actions, our investments, and our behaviors address systemic advantages in white communities earned and brought about through our history of legalized racism, and then building new systems that are intentionally racially just, inclusive, and equitable, and can sustain wealth, prosperity in ways that are shared across all races and geographies. We know that we've been successful in our own education, coaching, experiential learning, research, and change management services with organizations when their internal efforts start to produce impact on the outside of their organizations. And when we're fostering opportunity that is shared, economic mobility, and empowerment in sustainable ways. At the Center for Economic Inclusion, we've been compelled to conduct this particular research study on standing in the gap and the case for family sustaining wages in Minnesota after partnering with more than 100 businesses and local government organizations over the last several years to help them achieve goals and results that are sustainable, both on their own workforce and workplace, on their bottom line of those organizations, and in the communities where they work. Our ability to measure their ability to not just want to do good, but to do good is anchored in helping them have a full understanding of the gaps facing frontline workers and communities of color. Many of the employers that we've worked with over the last several years perceive the barriers to retention among these populations as biological. Yet we know that excellence is evenly distributed across racial populations. And therefore, it's important that each one of us, particularly as employers, take time to truly understand why these barriers continue to persist and why we continue to see occupational segregation. That means that we have to consider other variables that lead workers to continue to struggle to overcome life barriers and issues and needs such as housing, childcare, and transportation, and find out what it would take to allow all workers to be increasingly engaged and productive in the workplace and mobile in our economy. Ultimately, our research that you'll hear about in a moment reaffirmed our belief that increasing the number of employers who pay family-sustaining wages to all employees will have phenomenal impacts on both their own quality of life and well-being for employees, as well as the success of the employers and the well-being of our entire regional economy. But we're not only researchers here at the center. We live what we teach. That helps us know that our ideals and solutions are the right ones. Since the day our doors opened in 2017, we've had a base salary for all employees that exceeds the current Minnesota family sustaining wage. We've also invested in Black-led nonprofits to train, coach, and support over 400 men from North Minneapolis in obtaining sustainable careers in roles that also exceed the family sustaining wage here today. And over the last 3 years, we've invested more than $6 million in Black and Latino-owned businesses to help them also increase their capacity for contracts and to help them add more than 30 jobs that also pay exceeding the family sustaining wage for Minnesota. This tells us and tells you that we know what it takes, and we've also seen the benefits. We've led this way because we know that for far too long, occupational segregation has not only fed the stereotypes that position people who look like me and other shades of brown into roles far below our competence and our capabilities, but also because we know that when Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Asian people have jobs that pay their worth in workplaces where difference is celebrated, everybody wins. I hope that you've joined us today because you're walking in solidarity with us to build workplaces where everyone thrives. I'm thrilled for you to hear from an array of leaders and researchers and people who are living this effort to build our racially just economy every single day and who have both the stripes and the solutions to prove it. At this time, it gives me great honor to introduce you to the lead researcher for this report. Betsy Orn has led not only our own research here at the Center for Economic Inclusion and helping organizations embody the principles of racial justice and equity inside their organizations and measure its impact on the economy, but has also led in an intersection of racial justice and education and the economy in a number of organizations throughout her career. We're grateful for her leadership of this particular research endeavor. And now I introduce you to Betsy Orn to tell us a little bit about the research. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you so much, Tawana. Really appreciate it. It's such an honor to be here. Again, I just want to thank McKnight for investing in this project, and I want to make sure I send a special thank you to my co-authors on this report, Maggie Dalton and Joseph Ledley, who were really instrumental to this work. And I want to thank all of the workers and leaders who contributed their voices and insights to this effort. So as I get started sharing about our report, I want to ground us in a vision of Minnesota. Minnesota has long been known for its high quality of living, its great schools, its strong labor movement. Yet following the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin almost 4 years ago, another side of Minnesota became known across the world, a reality of racialized violence and white supremacy. And after that day, we heard from public officials and corporations across Minnesota and the nation that made public commitments in the pursuit of racial justice. They set diverse hiring targets. They invested in CDFIs. They committed to more recruitment at historically Black colleges and universities. All important things. Yet notably absent from all of these commitments was a commitment to improving wages for all workers. Next slide. Yet this is the number one way the public would like to see leaders invest in racial equity, because they know how important this is. In the midst of the uprising across US cities, Just Capital, a nonprofit focused on measuring and improving the social impact of America's largest public companies, surveyed the public on what actions companies should take to effectively meet this moment of racial reckoning. And the public's number one response, represented by 84% of those surveyed, was a desire for companies to commit to paying all employees a living wage. Next slide. And in addition to being popular with the public, as Tawana shared, we know that investing in frontline workers pays dividends to the entire community. Research has shown that when workers are paid a family-sustaining wage, it benefits their families, it benefits their employers, and it benefits the whole economy. Workers that are paid a family-sustaining wage are better able to provide the consistency their children need to succeed in school. I worked for years on issues related to the achievement gap. If we pay their families adequately, we'll see dividends in their educational results. Workers that are paid fairly are more likely to be able to contribute to their communities through volunteering and investing money back into local businesses and restaurants. They're also better able to be consistent employees. They're more dependable, provide stronger customer service, and are able to execute a company's strategy more effectively. And with higher wages, we see employers win too. They experience higher productivity, which leads to better pay and promotions of workers, lower turnover, improvements in customer service, and an increased ability to attract more of those frontline workers. So in this sense, the economy is like a garden. The more nutrients you add to the soil, the more the things that will grow in it, creating a positive feedback cycle that's good for all of us. Next slide. Yet in reality, we know that wages have not kept up, particularly with the historic inflation of the past few years. MIT recently released an update to its family sustaining wage indicator for 2024 just a few weeks ago. And the wage necessary for a family of 2 working adults and 2 children to sustain themselves in the state of Minnesota is now $29 an hour for each of those working adults. That means that the average family of 4 needs a family income of almost $120,000 to afford the basic costs of housing, food, childcare, healthcare, and transportation. And this estimate does not include any money for vacations, entertainment, restaurant meals, retirement savings, or education expenses. So if it feels like it's expensive to live today, it's because it is. And many families in Minnesota are not earning close to the amount that is needed. They're not paid enough to sustain their families. Next slide. So this report looked at 2021 census data to understand how many workers were earning a family sustaining wage at that time in comparison to what that number was, which was about $21 per hour. Just over half, about 55% of Minnesota's 2.8 million workers are paid at least a family sustaining wage. Yet Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous Minnesotans are the least likely to be paid a family sustaining wage, with only about 1/3 of all Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous workers reporting hourly wages above that threshold. Among Asian communities in Minnesota, Hmong workers are the largest cultural community with more than 40,000 workers, but they are the least likely to be paid a family sustaining wage at about 39%. Chinese workers and Indian workers, you can see on the slide, are more likely. Yet the issue impacts all Minnesotans. Approximately 3 in 4 workers that are paid less than a family sustaining wage are white. That means that there's almost 1 million white Minnesotans that are paid less than a family sustaining wage. Next slide. Our research dug into these racial disparities and discovered these inequities are largely driven by occupational segregation. That means that the job that people hold is largely predicted by their race. An example of this is that the most common job in Minnesota for Black Minnesotans is working as a health aide. Meanwhile, the most common job for white Minnesotans is working as a manager. And we looked at the top 10 occupations in Minnesota for each racial group in 2021 and compared them to the family sustaining wage at the time. And only one of the top 10 occupations for Hispanic workers was family sustaining. Only 2 of the top 10 occupations for Black and multiracial workers were family sustaining. And meanwhile, 7 out of the top 10 occupations for Asian and white workers were family sustaining. American Indian and Indigenous workers are not reflected on this slide because there's too few workers in each of these categories for that data to be reliable, but they are included elsewhere in our report. Next slide. We wanted to dig deeper to understand how this data was impacted by age, education, and gender. And so it's true that age does matter when it comes to wages. Fewer young workers are paid a family sustaining wage. So we know that more prime age workers, those between the age of 25 and 54, and older workers are paid a family sustaining wage. It's about 2 out of every 3 workers in that cohort earn that wage. But when you disaggregate by race, a very different story emerges. Only 40% of prime age Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous workers are paid a family sustaining wage, compared to about 2 out of 3 white workers in this age cohort. So this indicates that while some white workers and some Asian workers are able to graduate from lower paying entry-level jobs, a higher proportion of Black and brown workers remain stuck in low-wage jobs throughout their life. National research has also shown that many people are stuck in low-wage jobs for life. A study by Fuller and Rahman followed almost 200,000 workers who started in low-wage jobs in 2012. And 5 years later, it found that 60% of those workers remain stuck in similar positions. So age alone is not the answer. Next slide, please. Our research also confirms what we've seen in much national literature, that these disparities persist even among those with more education. So this graph shows you that among those with an associate's degree or more than 2/3 of Asian, multiracial, and white workers earn at least a family sustaining wage. Yet just over half of Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous workers with an associate's degree earn that wage, are paid that wage. Next slide. This graph here shows that women of all races are less likely to be paid a family sustaining wage than their male counterparts. And Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous women are the least likely to be paid a family sustaining wage in Minnesota. And this is particularly troubling because they are also the most likely to be single parents and need a family sustaining wage. 1 in 5 Black and brown female workers in Minnesota is a single parent, compared to 1 in 10 white female workers. So we know that this is a really critical issue for Minnesota families. Next slide. This report sought to understand who the workers are behind these numbers. So we looked at the top 30 jobs that are the most overrepresented by Black and brown workers and that are paid the least. And what we saw is that the jobs that are highlighted in this report are critical to our economy and society. In fact, when we looked at this list, we saw that nearly all of the 30 top occupations were deemed essential workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can read more about it in our report, but these include manufacturing workers, childcare workers, meatpacking workers, grocery workers. So yet, despite being called heroes, despite being asked to work through a global pandemic, many of these workers are not able to afford the basic necessities of life. So 4 of these essential jobs are highlighted here: care workers, cleaners, food service workers, and retail workers. Care workers that are made up of home health aides, nursing assistants, and childcare workers. They take care of the elderly, they take care of children, they work in care facilities, in homes. They ensure that people are able to live healthily and with dignity, right? This is such important work. And one of the stats that I have been very surprised to see is that 1 in 7 Black Minnesotan workers works in this field as a care worker. 1 in 7. And yet in 2021, the median pay for nursing assistants was $13.22 per hour. And there have been some gains since then, but it have not been near enough to keep pace with inflation and to give them the pay that they deserve. Cleaners, they're doing the critical work of taking care of our hospitals, making sure our schools and offices are clean. This group is very predominantly immigrants, overrepresented by women of color. And a maid, the average wage, the median wage in 2021 was $12.99 an hour. Food service workers work in hospital kitchens, restaurants, school cafeterias. I know people often think that these roles are tipped, but many of them are not. And the median wage for food prep workers in 2021 was $10.88 per hour. And then in retail, the folks that we interact with every day in grocery stores, convenience stores, hardware stores, cashiers, the median wage in 2021 was $10.84 an hour. So while there are unions that represent workers in each of these groups that have won some historic wage increases in the past couple of years, they only represent a fraction of these workers, and they are still far from what is needed to sustain a family consistently. These occupations are also greatly in demand. Personal care and home health aides are the top growing occupation in Minnesota. They're projected to grow by 24% in the next 10 years as our aging population continues to grow. So this means we cannot simply train people for better jobs. Our economy needs people to fill these essential jobs. We need people who can raise a family doing these essential jobs. Because as some workers move up the ladder, demand for this work doesn't go away, and we'll need other people to fill these positions. We need these to be better jobs. We need these to be good jobs. Next slide. So this research is really demonstrating an example of systemic racism that is around us all the time, but we don't talk about enough. And each of these roles has a connection to our country's legacy of slavery and history of oppression. Many of these roles were historically relegated to enslaved people or immigrants or women. And as we see across our society, laws and rules have maintained the way these roles are underpaid over time. As an example, during the New Deal, restaurant workers were excluded from minimum wage laws and instead were given tips. And that's largely because those jobs were held by Black and brown workers. That's systemic racism. We have never invested in care work as a community because we have been able to underpay women, Black and brown individuals, and recent immigrants to do this work. And care work, which is really the most important work in a society. As one of our panelists today, Tavana Johnson, said best, why is no one respecting the strength, tenacity, and power Black women bring to such when they're upholding such a critical profession? And I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about the persistence of these low wages today is connected to an economy that is currently designed so that the productivity gains of the last 40 years have overwhelmingly gone to shareholders, CEO compensation, and top earners, instead of to the essential workers that make our economy function. In fact, the average salary for an S&P CEO in Minnesota is $50,000 a day. Again, that's the equivalent of a family sustaining wage in a year. And it doesn't need to be that way. Next slide. To make progress on this issue, we need to see both private sector and government action. Private sector employers can and should do more to invest in essential workers. And the thing is, it can help their bottom line. The Good Jobs Institute, who you'll hear from more during our panel, has studied and worked with companies that have successfully designed jobs that not only provide decent pay and benefits and stable work schedules, but they also allow employees to perform well and find dignity in their work. The Good Jobs Institute has found time after time that these companies, from large companies like Costco to small companies like Mudbay Pet Supplies, see dividends in this approach with lower turnover, improved customer experience, higher employee productivity, and a better capacity to adapt to changes in the market. And they often outperform their competitors in the market. And yet, employers alone cannot improve all of these jobs. Many of these jobs depend on public dollars. Home health aides, for example, their salaries are largely controlled by Medicaid reimbursement rates. And we know that government policies don't do enough right now to hold bad employers accountable for bad practices and encourage good ones. Next slide. So this report shares three key recommendations, and I hope you all will take some time to read it and to share it with your networks. First and foremost, we must value workers and essential jobs. These are hard and important jobs. They involve an incredible amount of skill, emotional intelligence, patience, technical knowledge, often standing on your feet for many hours a day. Employers need to get to know these essential jobs and workers. Go live a life of your frontline workers for a day and tell me how much you think they deserve to be paid and how you can make their job better. There are many ways where you can ask your frontline employees about what they need, and you can make more investments to improve those. Policymakers must also improve wraparound supports and address safety conditions. We know that there are safety conditions that many of these workers have named. They also need to invest in wraparound supports, more investment in healthcare, childcare, transportation, and housing while addressing the benefits cliff. And we know that we must raise wages. Employers must prioritize family-sustaining wage as their #1 racial equity strategy. Look, we work with companies at the center all the time, and I truly believe that diverse hiring targets are critical. Procurement diversification is very important. But if you are really committed to racial equity, make this your #1 strategy. Focus on paying all of your employees a family-sustaining wage. Start by looking at what your roles that are overrepresented by Black and brown workers. I guarantee if you look at those, they will also have some pay discrepancies. So start there and figure out how can you invest in those frontline workers? How can you make sure that everyone is making that threshold? If they want to stay with your company over time, how can we get them there? The Met Council is actually an employer that we've worked with that set this as a goal, and they've made investments in many of their employers to reflect that. Investments in their drivers, investments in their mechanics, and that is really meaningful. So put your money where your mouth is. Policymakers must also intervene in broken markets, specifically those that disproportionately impact our Black and brown workers, like childcare and healthcare. In these markets, costs cannot be raised because they're already too high for most patients or families to afford, and the pay for these specific roles is too low for workers to sustain themselves. So it's often driving them to seek new jobs. And this is the sign of a classic market failure, a classic place where the government should step in and policymakers can do more to make these areas livable for everybody. Finally, we must shift power. Employers must share power with their essential workers to create strong companies. Create systems to listen to your frontline workers, especially Black and brown workers. Embrace unionization. Unions are doing this work every day, trying to help you understand what your workers need. Add workers to your corporate boards. If you really mean what you're saying, that's a real way to shift power. And policymakers must strengthen and enforce labor laws. Increase resources to enforce labor laws and combat wage theft. Make it harder for employers to retaliate against workers that try to form a union. There's been so much great progress on this issue in recent years, and yet there is so much further that we need to go. So I am so grateful for the opportunity to share about this important report. Again, please share it with your networks. Please use it to drive action. I'll turn it back over to Tawana, and I'm so excited for this panel that's going to talk more about this issue, what's currently being done, and what can be done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Betsy. A big thank you to you, not only for the presentation today, but also to you, to Joe Ledley, and to Maggie Dalton for your hard work and partnership with communities, with employers, and with workers to complete this study. As Betsy said, I am excited now to have a conversation with a number of leaders who have been not only respected in each of their own fields, but also who have been building worker power, who have been helping employers understand the importance of taking those actions that Betsy just articulated in our recommendations and ensuring that family-sustaining wages are the issue of this moment. Help me now to welcome our panelists. I'll introduce each one of them as they come into the Zoom room with us on today. First up is Tawana Johnson, a home health aide and SEIU organizer. Tawana has more than 20 years of home health care experience and hands-on experience with these issues as a family caregiver caring for her aging mother. She lives with and cares for this mother by applying the skills and influence that she's had over a number of years of experience, and is also an accomplished and influential leader and organizer. with SEIU, where she's had recent wins and gains that she'll share a little bit with us about for health aides at the state capitol. Welcome, Tavana. Sarah is Executive Director of the Good Jobs Institute, where she builds partnerships with companies who are looking to implement the Good Job strategy and creates resources to inspire all organizations who want to move from bad jobs to good jobs by having the tools and solutions and the belief in workers to be able to do so. Welcome, Sarah. Rena Wong is president of UFCW Local 663 and comes to her work building power and influence with workers in the labor movement through a beautiful tapestry of her own family history and journey. Rena is originally from California and is Chinese American by way of Mexico. Rena's family journey inspired her to leverage their experience as workers being paid low wages without benefits to care for their family and be able to create opportunities for higher education in her own work, working alongside and building power with workers. She's leading on the front lines to ensure that all workers are visible, thriving, and advancing in the workplace and winning. You'll hear more about that in a moment. Welcome. And Kit Brady, who's Executive Vice President over People Strategy and Executive Vice President of People Strategy at Gillette Children's, a global beacon of healthcare for patients with brain, bone, and movement conditions. Over her 20-year tenure at Gillette, Kit has led talent acquisition, human resources, and education development efforts, defining the strategy for managing talent with a commitment to fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Welcome, Kit. And last, but certainly not least, we have Munir Karcher-Ramos, who is Program Director of the Vibrant and Equitable Communities at the McKnight Foundation. Munir joined the McKnight Foundation after founding and serving as Director of the City of St. Paul's Office of Financial Empowerment. Under his guidance, the city introduced transformative and nationally acclaimed initiatives to increase economic opportunity and shared ownership. Munir has led in a number of community roles and has always been anchored in today's topic of building power in communities and driving racial justice and equity. Welcome to each of you. What a phenomenal panel to have in our presence on today and to be able to share with us what's working and what challenges continue to lie ahead for us in meeting the recommendations highlighted in this research report. Tavana, I'm going to start with you. We know, as we said in the bio, that you've worked for a number of years in healthcare and as a health aide, knowing that, as Betsy shared, this is a role that 1 in 7 Minnesota African Americans serve in each day in Minnesota. Can you kick us off by sharing what you wish leaders and employers truly understood about this vital job in our communities?
So I wish that the leaders would understand how mentally, physically, and emotionally taxing my job is, and how it's not just domestic work. I'm a healthcare worker who serves in a domestic capacity as well. So I literally have 2 jobs in one. I basically let my clients use my body as an extension to their own. So anything that they can't do is the things that I do. I'm transferring people from bed to tub, from bed to chair, I'm positioning them. And that's a lot of work on my body. And as I get older, I can feel the wear and tear on my body. I'm also in charge of managing their households, making sure they have a safe space to live in, making sure that they have healthy, nutritious meals of their own choosing that I'm able to prepare for them, grocery shopping for them, running their errands, such as banking or the post office or whatever you might need. My job is to make sure that my clients are happy, safe, and healthy and live with dignity and integrity in their own homes and are able to engage in their communities as they shall wish. So I wish that, my leaders would understand that my job requires the respect of professionalism and the monetary pay to prove that I am a respected member of my community, helping my community members out one client at a time.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you articulating the ins and outs of the job, the everyday work, but also the everyday wear and tear on the body, the mind, the spirit that occurs through this work that is so vital, not just for our economy, but for every single one of us in our communities. Munir, I want to come over to you for a moment. and ask you to share a little bit about what you've observed throughout your career at seeing the effects of low wages on individuals and families. Some of these effects that we know are just not often discussed or may even seem to be invisible, as Tavana shared, wanting to be visible, needing to be visible in our community. McKnight has certainly been supporting the center's efforts to drive this wage equity, but you've been a partner with us for years, and we'd love to hear your voice on this topic.
Great. First, want to thank you to the Center for Economic Inclusion for the opportunity to be with you all today. McKnight, we're very excited about the report, and our team wants to give our many thanks to Betsy, Maggie, Joe. Delivered such a rich report that we know will have legs that will inform action, for many years to come. So, yes, I'm in week 6 at McKnight and previously led the Office of Financial Empowerment with the city of St. Paul. Our major focus there was on financial health and community wealth. And as I think about financial health and the effects of low wages, I think about the struggle to weather economic shocks or emergencies. We know that national research shows that 40% of households cannot afford a $400 emergency, from repairing a tire to paying an insurance deductible to other types of emergencies. So if a mother or father struggle to make that dollar stretch, to the end of the month, it is nearly impossible to set aside much savings to cushion, that unpredictable, emergency. And in my work at the city, it's why, we're at the leading edge of launching guaranteed income programs, $500, monthly, cash transfer, no work requirements, no conditions to it. And what the research was showing there, which I think does tie back to wages, is that it highlights sort of a reduction is when they had that cushion, right? When they had that cushion of, a guaranteed income, there was a reduction in chronic stress, right? That was induced by financial uncertainty. So all said, as I think there's a direct connection between financial health and mental health that is often under the radar when thinking about how it connects to low and unsustainable wages.
Thanks so much for that, Munir. I want to follow up on that just a bit. McKnight has certainly worked and supported our efforts to close the racial gap by helping employers and policymakers create good jobs. And you noted kind of the shocks and stresses that really occur to anybody who's living, right? But the inability often to be able to manage those things. As we've gone forward in pursuing employers and policymaker action that would address building racial justice, really by having the right standards, can you talk to us about what you see, Munir, needs to be done to support families so they're not simply surviving, but move into that place of thriving in the economy?
Yeah, and I think it's not just one thing. And I think as we think about family sustaining wages, it's actually about how do you hold the complexity, of the issue. We're not going to program our way out, or we're not going to policy our way out of the issue. It also isn't about placing that onus on the individual family or that individual worker, right? We must attend to those structural issues, those systemic issues that undergird, the impacts of those wages. So yes, we need a $25 per hour family sustaining wage. That could come through public policy or action, in the private sector. However, neither policy nor, private sector action will often come without, demand, right? So I think about, what do we need for strong, labor unions and worker centers who organize worker power to fight, both at the policy level and for, better workplace environments, with the public sector. I think as well as I think about it, we need shift the narratives and really look at those underlying racist and classist sort of mental models, which undergird, the type of pay that, is placed, on the different types of jobs that were mentioned in the presentation. I also think, we need that regulatory, environment rooted, in that sort of intervenes in, those exploitative wages, wage theft. So as I think about, the support, that the families need, I focus less on sort of the wraparounds, but more on some of the structural solutions, knowing it's not one thing, it's a both and all solutions that actually hold the complexity that'll allow move in driving up wages.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that notion of the complexity that is involved here, that certainly we can prioritize strategies, but this doesn't absolve any one sector or organization or leader from their responsibility in ensuring that we're moving people up the economic ladder by having this focus on family sustaining wages. Kit, I want to come over to you as an employer. The report we've issued, Standing in the Gap, Building the Case for Family Sustaining Wages, really outlines and articulates the business case for employers to consider ways that they can advance their wages, they can improve benefits, and to Tamana's point earlier, can be intentional about ensuring that all employees are workers. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you at Gillette have seen a focus on worker economic mobility and sustainability and racial justice improve things for the organization, and talk to us about how the changes you all have made over a number of years are resonating with the organization and driving outcomes in the business?
Sure. I thought it would be challenging to directly link our minimum pay at Gillette with specific improvements in recruiting, retention, engagement, patient experience. But I think the positive outcomes have really been evident, and they're making a difference for our patients and families, as well as for Gillette. So, in the last half of 2022, our executive team resolved to raise our minimum pay rate by $4 an hour, and then to continue to increase that minimum each year. And there were a lot of reasons to do this. We wanted to be an employer of choice, but also working towards offering a livable wage over time. And we recognize our workforce is really dedicated. And Tamana, your story really, I think, resonates with me too. We want our workforce to have a fulfilling career path at Gillette rather than having to juggle multiple jobs to make ends meet. So this has really been a good investment for Gillette and our employees. And we've seen really great results since implementing this change a couple of years ago. So our turnover in those roles that were impacted has decreased, especially in the first year. Our rate of unfilled positions has declined. So we were using temporary employees that we have not had to do that anymore. We had positions taking 60 days to fill. We've got that down to 45. So that's 2 weeks sooner that we can get people to start when we have an open position. And then we've seen employee satisfaction go up too. We ask about every year, would you recommend Gillette as a great place to work? And we've seen those scores, which were already pretty high, over 4 in a scale of 1 to 5, go up 3 to 5% right after these changes. So we see that, I think, that result. I do just want to say, our strategy goes beyond just retaining employees in those current roles. We do want to see them advance. In the last 12 months, we've had several employees in nursing assistant and patient care technician roles that have been promoted to RN after they complete their degree. And by doing this, I think having the stabilized workforce, it helps us build this dedicated, knowledgeable workforce that knows our patients and the care we provide. And then that reduces our recruiting costs for those harder to fill RN roles, as well as offering much higher wages to them once they have those degrees. We even have employees in non-patient care roles who are going back to get their degrees with support. And we anticipate, they'll stay with us after they get their degrees. And just a quick story, one of the most, I think, impacted areas is the area where patients called to schedule. And I talked to the leader of that area who really credits the change in pay with stabilizing the team and allowing for more internal movement. So as the new employees come in and stay, they're able to build a workforce that can do more complex roles. And that's really allowed for internal promotions. She said that the turnover is down, and that's allowed the backlog to get caught up. They're scheduling people, patients in, and we're really able to see patients faster. So you can see that's good for our patients. So just to say, we're really, that investment in competitive wages, really at every level, to support employees, it reflects our belief in investing in our employees is good for them. It's good for Gillette. It's also good for our patients and families.
Thanks so much. It's been wonderful to observe the journey that Gillette has been on. The center had the benefit of conducting Gillette's first racial equity study tied to DEI. really examining the data and walking alongside Kit and Barbara Jors and their leadership team and board in really hearing and observing the data and then charting a path forward. And so kudos to you all, Kit, for really taking a data-informed approach that didn't just say kind of where are wages today and where do employees want them to be, but how is this going to help our ability to create the very best environment for patients and patient service and delivery, and to be able to see that it's paying off now many years later is wonderful to see and an example for other employers. Thank you so much for sharing those examples. I want to come over to Rena before I come back to all of you with a few questions. In the last few years, we've seen a number of wins among labor movements from Starbucks to Amazon nationally, but then also here locally with Cub Foods and Hormel, having workers mobilizing to exercise their voices and rights, make their jobs and the impacts of those jobs truly visible in communities and among decision makers, and be able to have some successful wins. And we gave great kudos to you, your team and members. Can you talk to us about what is unique, though, about this particular moment and how you see workers in the labor movement achieving these wins? And as you do so, please throw in some wins that UAW has experienced as well and describe for us what it took to get to this point.
Sure. So I want to share a story with you about one of our members. She is from Ethiopia, from Addis Ababa, and she came to the U.S. when she was 18. She had a 5-month-old son at the time, and she has worked in the meatpacking industry for 23 years, 19 of those years at Hormel. And now she's a machine operator on the Spam line, actually, with 8 kids. And that 5-month-old son is now grown up, right? And in this contract negotiations and contract campaign, she was able to win because those workers organized together in this contract campaign. She has went from $20.60 to $23.60 in the first year alone. That's a $3 an hour increase. And so if you do the math, that's $6,000 in straight time wages alone. And by the end of the contract, it'll be $10,000 more dollars than she has today. And she was making $42,000 before. So if you think about it, $10,000 more on top of $42,000 is actually life-changing for families. And what we're seeing from and hearing from your research and that of others is that even that is not a family-sustaining wage. Right? And what we know is that folks are struggling. People are working in retail. People are working 3 or 4 jobs. That means people are working 75 to 90 hours a week to make what used to be a 40-hour paycheck. Just think about that. People are working 75 to 90 hours to make what it used to take 40 hours to be able to sustain their families. And so folks are at a breaking point. We have had our members called essential. We have had them called heroes for keeping us fed throughout this pandemic. Yet we have not been able to show them that gratefulness and to value their work and to value their hearts and the lives, their lives that they have sacrificed in these years to keep us fed. And I think, frankly, that juxtaposition of being called a hero and being called essential and then coming to the table and negotiations and being offered 25 cents, 30 cents, it makes people feel just not valuable when 2 minutes ago you called them heroes. And so what we're seeing and what we know in our hearts is that folks are worth more, and workers also are drawing that stark contrast and saying that they're worth more. And that's why you're seeing all this activity. That's why you have seen in our union at UFCW 663, members taking strike votes. We had members across all of our grocery stores take strike votes. They have not done that for 30 or 40 years. I have members who have literally been in the union 30, 40 years and said, I've never done this because I never believed I had to. And now I know I have to, because if I don't do this, how is my kid gonna eat? How am I gonna see my son when I am working 80 hours a week? And that is just the reality. that family sustaining wages means just that, it sustains families so that they can thrive instead of just barely survive. And I think folks are seeing that with Starbucks workers, with a bunch of younger workers as well, who know that how much they're making is not even going to lead to the same standard of life their parents have. You see that with the UAW workers who have been so amazing and inspiring in Tennessee. I was like refreshing that web browser every 2 minutes to see what that vote was coming in. And workers are saying that they've had enough, that they deserve more, they want more, and they're organizing together to win more. Because at the end of the day, we got to take care of ourselves, we got to take care of our kids.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for articulating that and for really standing on the front lines of this movement. One of the things, Rena, that I find is challenging as we go out and try to educate is during the height of the pandemic, all of us had similar situations. And so we could, I think there was a little more empathy among employers to say, oh yeah, that might not have led to the changes in policy, but there was a public cry out to say we need essential workers. As Betsy noted in the research, those workers are still essential for our economy. But as we walk our way out of a pandemic into going back into some normal operations, that level of empathy translating to strategic action that kind of dismantles systemic bias, we're seeing less of that. Can you talk to us just a moment about why it's important to really understand the essential nature of workers who have been paid at wages that just simply don't allow them to thrive, and why we have to shift that mindset?
You know, these workers have always been essential. Just COVID finally drew the stark relief about who gets to work from home and who has to actually show up every day, right? That is what COVID taught us all very clearly. Who is it who is essential? Because without them showing up every day, none of us eat, none of us gets medical care, none of us gets to where we need to get to, none of our kids are able to learn, right? And so I just want to lift that up, that these folks have always been essential. We just now know it in a different way because we've had to live through this pandemic together. And in terms of, you know, what's needed and how do we shift from just paying lip service to really valuing people, it is the wages. Folks want to work. They really do. Nobody wants to be dependent. Folks want to work. They want agency in their own lives. Joining a union means that workers get a chance to have some control and some agency in their own lives of being able to negotiate wages and benefits. And that's a shift that we need to see happen so that workers really, truly have a voice and have agency in their own lives. And on the employer's end, we need employers to really think about what it means to value your workers. It is not just about saying you value your workers, it is about showing them through sharing the profits of what that value is, because we have to live our values, and how much you pay somebody shows that very starkly every day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Sarah, I want to come over to you. The Good Jobs Institute has been leading on these types of initiatives, helping employers understand that a good job isn't simply the wage. It's not simply because you say you have a good job, but it takes many things to really comprise that. I wanted you to talk to us a little bit about the misconception you see from business leaders in particular about the way that we define quality jobs and how those quality jobs are driving financial performance from that view. Can you share some both examples of the context, but then also perhaps a success story where you've seen a business take those steps similar to Gillette to be able to really embrace a good jobs concept?
Absolutely. It's great to be here. We work directly with companies that employ essential workers. And so, Kit, when you mentioned giving a $4 an hour wage increase, amazing. Rita, when you mentioned some of your union members getting a $3 plus wage increase, amazing. We're working with the company leaders who are on the other side of that. And what they're doing is some math on the back of an envelope. And they're saying, I have 40,000 workers and I want to give them a $4 raise. And that's going to be $100 million, $200 million, $300 million. And I don't see and I don't understand how I'm going to get that back. I don't understand the work they do. I don't understand the value they provide. And I can't tie the incredibly important work they do to how we win as a company. So the first thing we do is I think there's just a misconception about how incredibly essential workers are, not just to all of our families and communities, but to the companies that they are a part of. So we help companies really break that out. I think when you're in industries that have high turnover, which retail, senior care, direct care, restaurants all have really high turnover, there's a conception that this is just the way you do business and this is just the way it's going to be and this is it. It doesn't have to be that way, and it's much more expensive and much less competitive to operate in a bad jobs, high turnover environment. So we help companies sort of break that out. What's the direct cost of turnover? What are all of the execution costs when you have folks who are coming in who haven't been well trained and who don't know the job and who can't execute really well by no fault of their own? And then what are those big competitive costs? How are you able to adapt and differentiate if you've got turnover of 100, 200%? And these are some of the numbers that we see in the companies that we work with. 200% turnover is just absolute chaos at the frontline level. So we help them think about that. And then we help them envision a different kind of system, a system where you invest more in people and you also make their jobs better. So you invest in pay and stable schedules and career paths and safety and security. And then you also invest in the dignity and design of that work so that every day they can come in and succeed in front of customers, be productive, contribute to your mission as a company, and make these jobs sustainable for both families and workers and also for those companies. So we've been on this journey with, some of the biggest companies in the country to some of the smallest. So Sam's Club has been on a good jobs journey now for several years, and they've made really impressive wage commitments to, for instance, their team leads and some other key roles like butchers and cake decorators who were always with their members and really important for them when they were starting their good jobs journey. They raised their wages $5 to $7 an hour, which got them to, great wages. They were destination jobs, and they've since raised their starting wage for everybody in their company. And they continue to be on this journey. I think it's never over. They also have more full-timers, so more careers you can have at Sam's. And they have block schedules. So if you're a full-timer, when you're working, which of course is incredibly important for a family life. And they also changed and improved the work. So they said, what drives work that doesn't add value, that is hard for people, that doesn't sort of intrinsically value the wonderful humanity that all of us have. And they made the work better. So that was really important at Sam's, and there's lots you can read in Harvard Business Review about some of the work they've done. We've also worked with a restaurant company with 2 restaurants in Maine, run by a solo entrepreneur. And he, looked at the turnover and it was too much and the food quality wasn't good. The customers didn't know people who were there and there was no community and there was no quality. And he said, I got to do something different. And he invested heavily in his workers to about $24, $25 an hour in Maine. And this was about $200,000 a year for him. And he said, it was like, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this. But instead of just saying it's a big cost, he said, wait, what can we gain? What are my unrealized potentials here? What if we raised sales 15%? What if we increased catering 10%? And they did that and more so because they invested in people, asked them to be part of shaping the work, and created just a very different system, which created very different jobs and a very different outcome for their company, which has enabled them to keep investing in people. So it's very possible. It's very powerful when you can do it. And you've got to get out of the mindset of people as a cost and really build a system that allows people to thrive.
Absolutely phenomenal results and leadership and helping employers who have such a large impact on our economy really take action that can not only, to your point, one of the quotes I just noted that you were sharing, is not only improving the employer's life on the job, but improving their life holistically by taking these actions. So a big kudos to you and a thank you for the work that you're leading. I want to ask a couple questions for all of you, and we invite our audience to be able to drop questions into the Q&A platform for the speakers as well. First, I want to ask about the roots of history. The roots of our economy's challenges with low wages take us back to America's history, stealing land from indigenous people and stealing Black labor from Africa in order to build wealth for free. Martin Luther King told us no labor is truly menial unless you're not getting adequate wages. And throughout the pandemic, we felt like we might be making traction on this issue as the term essential workers, as I noted earlier, became more and more commonplace. Yet progress has been slow. Can you all share what you believe has to shift to get to a place of true progress? Is it our mindsets? Is it policies and systems? Is it the ways that we relate to one another? Or is it something else?
I mean, for, my perspective, the thing that I have seen in my life change workers' lives are unions, right? My first experience of a union was watching immigrant women janitors go out on strike because they wanted to be visible. And I saw them fight hard and put their families' lives, on the line because they couldn't get a paycheck. And they won that fight so that they could have better afford to take care of those kids. And in the years since then, 20 something years since, that is what I have seen and that is what I have lived. And so I can only speak from my own experience that workers having that agency, having that ability to negotiate together and to say together that they need more, that is what's been able to change workers' lives and has been able to help folks achieve family sustaining wages, health insurance, retirement benefits so they can retire with dignity when they're done working. And we need policies nationally and statewide that actually allow for workers to choose to form a union free of intimidation, right? And I know for employers how that must sound of like, oh, we're gonna have a union, it's gonna be a contentious and we're gonna have fights all the time. And the reality is, no, don't want to be fighting. Our members don't want to be fighting. They want to collaborate. They want to come to a place of building consensus together, but they want to be heard and they want a seat at the table and they just want to be respected for that work. And so, I would hope that as a country, we can really help strengthen our democracy by allowing workers democracy in their workplace, and that on the employer's end, that folks really take a hard, deep look and say, let us figure out how we build consensus and collaboration with workers so that they are getting what they need to build good lives. And we as employers are getting what we need by having folks who are happy to be here with us generating revenue. It doesn't feel complicated. It feels really simple most days.
Others, this is a living room conversation at this stage, so feel free to jump in if you have other thoughts before I go to another question.
So I would like to comment as well. I know as a home care worker, my wages are funded by the state and the federal. I'm state funded, federally matched, but I do feel like if the wealthy few would pay their fair share in taxes, that would enable people in my genre of work to be able to have access to healthcare, because I don't have access to healthcare benefits at this time, and maybe a retirement program where I mean, like after I've worked 20 years in this industry, I could have something to rely on in my old age when I need a home care worker myself. I think those types of policies down at the Capitol are very important for people to understand that there's enough for everyone. We just have to share. So.
Thank you so much, Tavana. Can you all talk to us about what policy changes might occur? And we see we've got questions coming in the chat I'm going to ask a bit later, but I think one of the kind of constant narratives is a question about, should this be a policy issue that's simply on every employer? Or do we in fact need statewide or citywide policies, federal policies that would move us in this direction and incentivize employer action? What are your thoughts?
So I'm a fan of statewide and federal wide policies that incentivize people to move in this direction, because I mean, like I said, I'm in a unique position where my employer is the state. So I mean, like if policies and plans were put into place at the state level, which all businesses had to follow, then we could move in a direction that would be so great for Minnesota and Minnesota workers, that would improve the communities which I live in. So yeah, I'm for the statewide, federally wide funded policies and programs.
Thank you. Any others on this one? Rena?
I mean, I feel like we've seen some changes in this last legislative session in Minnesota. So many great things that we were able to do together as a state. Everything from paid medical family leave to earn sick and safe time, those are very meaningful in people's lives, to banning captive audience meetings so that workers truly can choose to form a union without feeling like they have to sit through this meeting with the employer telling them why it's a bad idea, right? Like that encourages democracy for folks to be able to not have to sit through those meetings. And then this legislative session in Minnesota, we have unemployment insurance for striking workers that is being heard. We are a part of a coalition that is helping to develop a green energy workforce training hub through the Rise Up Center so that we have more women, Black, Brown, New American folks who are then going to have access to training with childcare on site to be able to skill up into these higher paying union jobs. And so there is a lot of room locally in our state that we currently have taken on and can continue to take on, as well as federally, that workers should have the right to organize, right? So it is both. It is not an either or, for sure.
Absolutely. I want to ask you all to consider, I think, a piece from the report. So the report describes the ways that essential workers, yet underpaid jobs, are overwhelmingly held by Black and Brown people. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see history showing up in the decisions, the policies, both, again, government policies and business and employer policies, and what we can do to make sure that the narrative that, whether it's workers themselves or organizations who are on the call, or even advocates within employers, might take on this topic and work for more equitable pay? What narratives should they be promoting, and what narratives have you seen to be less effective?
Yeah, I do appreciate in the report, right? It's acknowledging sort of root causes, and part of that is history, right? And as I think about not too distant history, I do think about the economic restructuring that sent jobs overseas, right? So many of those Fortune 500 corporations right here in the Twin Cities, right, used to have manufacturing and factories right here, right in our neighborhoods, St. Paul, Minneapolis, right? And trade agreements, other factors of the global economy, looking at lower wages, in other countries, right, sent those jobs, overseas, right? And we're talking about tens of thousands of local working class, family sustaining wage jobs, predominantly occupied by Black and Brown workers, disappeared over the arc of a few decades. And as I think about my work at Promise Neighborhood, in the historic African-American neighborhood, Rondo, I remember listening to so many moms and dads, sharing how their parents had family sustaining wages at the Ford plant or at the 3M, factory or distribution center. And I remember them talking about how the jobs that helped their parents buy homes and have a retirement, disappeared, and that they feel like they're experiencing, intergenerational downward economic mobility because those working class jobs are no longer available and not available at scale. So as I think about narrative and I think about case making, for family sustaining wage, I think it'd be really impactful to specifically quantify, right, how many of those jobs disappeared from our local economy because of those shutdowns, closures, decisions, right? Sure, those decisions will be masked behind market forces, but someone or someone's, right, made the decision, to close those factories, in their own backyard, right? So we should be asking, did that decision drive 500 living wage jobs, 5,000 living wage jobs, and if the corporations, for example, want to invest in their hometowns, one of the most powerful things they can do, right, is that is in their control, right, is to actually have jobs that pay well. And that takes acknowledging history of some of their long run sort of disinvestment, in their own hometowns, in their own backyards. And I think, how do we cast narrative that can be grounded in what that disinvestment looked like?
Yeah, I mean, this report is so fantastic, and your recommendations are fantastic. And I'm not going to pick a favorite because you can't. But that employers must prioritize family sustaining wages as their #1 racial equity strategy is really powerful. I mean, the whole sort of workforce world and everything every day that we live is sort of imbued with a history of bias and racism and misogyny. And my colleague Zainab Tan, Amanda Silver, and I wrote a teaching note about the history of the term low-skilled work. It's not going to be a surprise to any of you. I will pop it sort of in the chat, but low-skilled work is the work done by Black and Brown people, women, immigrants, etc. So The United States had a dictionary of occupational titles, and it felt very scientific and everyone's feeling good about it. When you actually dig into it, this is my favorite / least favorite part of this report. Jobs such as nursery school teacher and practical nurse were coded as having minimal to no significant relationship to data, to people, to things, whereas jobs such as a dog pound attendant were rated as functioning in a higher level of complexity. A typist, a job mainly held by women, no significant relationship to complexity, to judgment, to anything. A type machine setter, that is a male job, very complex, right? So there's so much built into every part of the way that we talk about work. And so sort of breaking that and understanding what that looks like, and never, ever using the term low skilled work, which I think is often used, Tavana, in the work that you do. It's absolutely heartbreaking. You are helping to make people's lives better. You are saving people's lives. You're the first line of defense, looking at nutrition and cognitive decline and skin health and all of these things in elders, that can preserve their dignity and way of life. So that is not low skilled work.
In the health, I'll just add in, I think in healthcare and just the 20 years that I've been, working in this field, we've seen more and more education get added onto jobs for people. So a job that you could do with no degree or maybe a bachelor's degree 20 years ago, more and more we're asking for master's and doctorate level degrees, and that's happening at the state level too. So I think relooking at what are we asking people to have, because a lot of times who can afford to get that education has nothing to do with who can do the job best. And I think from a policy standpoint, looking at some of that, or looking at how we support people to get those certifications and degrees, if that's what's required, would be helpful too.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your responses to those. I'm going to come over to a couple of our questions from the audience. Ali Ahmed shares with us, thank you for the insightful research that accurately portrays the daily struggles faced by workers. It provides a genuine reflection of the challenges workers encounter frequently. Can you all please share any measures or changes you believe are necessary to improve wages and ensure a safer working environment for non-unionized meatpacking workers?
And so we represent meatpacking workers at UFCW, and the thing that would actually help improve these jobs is really allowing workers a seat at the table. And the way that I know how to do that is for workers to have a union and for us to actually do the hard work of having conversations with workers to build proposals and ask them for what would make a difference in their life, and then having those conversations with the employer across a table where workers are equal partners in figuring it out, right? I think just nobody wants to be told, right? Nobody wants to be told what's best for them. They just want to be able to have a say in being able to talk about, for safety wise, I work on the line, right? The speed is too fast. I cannot manage to keep up with the production. They want to be able to share that. And then they want to be asked, well, what would help you be able to do that? Is it different equipment? Is it more people on the line? Is it truly just slowing it down? That feels like a great conversation to have with employers. And for workers or to be able to do that, we need to have structure. We need to have organization. And the way that we know to do it, as we do in our health and safety committees through our union, is to have labor management committees, is to have health and safety committees, is to go together and have industrial engineers walk the plants together, right? That is how we make these changes in this daily practical way versus in this idea sort of way.
Thank you so much for that. We've got a couple of questions that are focused on the nonprofit sector, recognizing that a few of us on the call today are working in nonprofits. And Kate notes for us that nearly 20% of Minnesota's workforce are employed by nonprofit organizations, which, despite being mission driven, are also at times guilty of underpaying employees and contributing to occupational segregation. Munir, here's a question for you, and I'll tag in some too, about a perspective about philanthropy's role in ensuring that the nonprofit sector are paying equitable wages and wages that allow people to thrive in a family-sustaining environment.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and really looking at wages across nonprofit industry, it's varies tremendously. And as I think about the role of philanthropy, I mean, there's an uneven sort of power dynamic between philanthropy and the nonprofits, right? And what we can do and what we could think about in philanthropy, is partnering with those nonprofits and like what is setting the agenda around wage, right? And how does then grant making and other philanthropic efforts sort of align back to that, right? So instead of the average, I'll just make it up, a general operating grant being $100,000, is it $150,000 as we think about, livable wages and that sort of thing? And I think, what does it get indexed to, and what do we look at, as we think about, how to sort of co-create, an agenda around, adequate wages, and how do dollars actually, back that up? And I could think maybe a parallel, would be as, looking at sort of inflation, right? That $100,000 grant in 2020 does not equal the $100,000 grant today. And, thinking about what could be, as we think about particularly family sustaining wages and, setting a standard around that across, the industry, and getting philanthropy to really follow and invest accordingly.
Thanks so much for that, Munir. Certainly, as a founder and a CEO of a nonprofit who came out of philanthropy prior to creating the center, I worked really hard in 2017 to ensure our new employees to come would have the same levels of benefits and salary that we'd experienced in the philanthropic sector, because I was bringing employees over from that sector, and know that, as was stated in a couple of the questions we combined here, it is particularly difficult to find funders who believe that that standard should be equitable from philanthropy over into the service industry and nonprofit sector, and who do also not just believe it in ideals, but also who resource organizations such that they can maintain the salaries, and then also contract with small businesses and communities of color who are then also creating family sustaining wages. And so kudos to you all at McKnight, not only for doing so, but also continuing to influence other funders to do the same. I've got one last question I'm going to work to squeeze in here. And this person, Mauricio, thanks this group for a great discussion, and ask, what are the projected long-term economic impacts on local businesses if family sustaining wages are implemented? And Sarah, I heard you say earlier that you all have worked with very large organizations like Sam's Club, but also very small employers. And so would love to start with you and then come over to others about what are the economic impacts, and is this sustainable for businesses that are family owned or small businesses?
Yeah, so I mean, again, the economic impact for companies can be very, very positive. We have, companies who've built this into their DNA, like Costco, and we have companies who've really evolved into a good jobs model, like Sam's. We're looking at all sorts of industries. So the essential jobs we're talking about here today, but also call centers and manufacturing and warehousing and distribution and distributed services like pest control and HVAC. We are working with, very small companies. We're working with public companies who have investors. We're working with private equity, who, there's an increasing number of private equity investors like Pete Stavros at KKR, who really understand that investing in people can have a huge benefit for the company and also the community. He just did a TED Talk. I recommend it. It's really amazing what his employee ownership model has done, again, for companies, but also for workers who have gotten, tremendous payouts when businesses are sold, and they've worked there for 20 years and they've gotten that retirement. So big positive impacts.
Rena or Munir or others, any other additional responses? Thank you so much for that, Sarah. Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us. This conversation has helped us not only explore the research in the report from the Center for Economic Inclusion, but also hear the voices of employers, of advocates, of champions, and union workers. So thank you so much for leaning into this. But more than that, I want to say thank you to each one of you for the work that you do every day inside your organizations. I also want to say a big thank you to each of you who joined us in solidarity on today to ensure that you're gathering both the research and insights that are needed to be able to power inclusion, to help organizations and leaders reckon with the truth so that we have justice in our workplaces and ensure that everyone can thrive inside our workplaces. A big thank you again to the McKnight Foundation for sponsoring the research conducted by our team, and a thank you to Betsy, to Andrea, to Maggie, and to Joe, who led the research within the Center for Economic Inclusion. In the chat has been a link to this research has been dropped into the chat. You'll also receive emails from us giving you more insights from the research and opportunities to amplify it both in your organizations, your spheres of influence, and of course, online. A big thank you for all the ways that you support the Center for Economic Inclusion and continue to help us create regional economies that truly work for everyone. We say thank you and blessings to you for joining us on today.